In this video I'm going to talk about a very special type of garment. It is considered a classic, which is versatile and sporty at the same time. It has also been reinterpreted across the fashion spectrum, from Alaia to Zimmermann, from ASOS to Zara. You may have already guessed it, I'm going to talk about the trench coat. And I'm going to share on the one hand the history, how was this trench coat invented, who invented it and why is it called trench coat. But on the other hand, I'm also going to share the details that you need to look out for if you are interested in buying a trench coat. When we think about the trench coat, the first brand that probably comes into our mind is Burberry. I'm going to talk about this kind of competition among quite a few producers of the trench coat a bit later. Just one side note here, this is a non-sponsored video. I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. What we actually need to look into is the name. Trench coat already hints at something, and this is that the roots lie within the military. What is a trench? A trench is a dig used in warfare and especially in World War I. And this is also one reason why a lot of people think the trench coat was invented during World War I, but this is actually a misconception. I will go into the details a bit later, but there was an influence due to World War I. It became more common. It also got the shape that we know today. But the invention or the development of the trench coat goes further back to the 19th century. And actually we can say we need to go back to the 18th century. And while the trench coat is also associated with Britain today, not only because of the bad weather, but the whole development, we actually need to look to Spain. Because Christopher Columbus brought back rubber in the 15th century. And since then, people have experimented with the material, and also in continental Europe, people experimented with rubber and how it could be used also for garments. And now we need to travel back to Britain because there was a scientist or chemist called Charles Mackintosh, and he experimented with liquid rubber. He wanted to know what happens if you put it on textiles, and what he did is he developed a method where he put liquid rubber onto different type of textiles. He also then kind of glued them together with the rubber, or he sandwiched them, as one article says, and he patented this method in 1823. And he then created a certain type of coat which soon became known under the Mac. It was weatherproof, so also waterproof, which is very important in Britain where it rains a lot. And it was used for horseback riding, but Mackintosh also supplied the military with this innovative textile. But now you may say trench coat and Burberry go hand in hand. Why am I bringing up this guy Mackintosh? It is similar to what I said in my video about Louis Vuitton and the other trunk makers. A lot of people were experimenting with similar methods and textiles at the same time, and this was also the case when it comes to these coats. And there's another person that I would like to introduce to you. He's called John Emery. Maybe the name rings a bell, but I doubt it, but I will tell you later. I'm sure you have heard about his brand. He also worked on waterproof textiles as well, and the Mac had one significant disadvantage. It was weather resistant, waterproof, but also not really breathable. What does this mean? It was a bit stinky. So Emery came up with another textile that was more breathable. He patented it in 1853, and his so-called wrappers became very, very popular with the posh crowd who was outdoors, for example, hunting. And I said before, John Emery maybe doesn't ring a bell, but I'm sure you know Aquascutum. And this was the brand that he founded, and it is actually still around. Aquascutum comes from Latin. Aqua means water, scutum means shield. So I think this is quite a good name for a company producing waterproof textiles. And now coming back to Burberry, I'm talking about Aquascutum, and before I mentioned Burberry, and when you read most of the articles, it's always a bit this competition between Aquascutum and Burberry, who invented the trench coat. And the problem is that it's actually not that easy to determine, because as I said, a lot of people were working on the same materials, on the same processes, on similar designs, and also they wanted to solve a particular need. And it was not only Aquascutum and Burberry, there were also other producers in the same space making these textiles. And as I said before, all of this happened roughly at the same time, because Thomas Burberry founded his namesake label in 1856. I mentioned that John Emery patented his method in 1853. And Thomas Burberry applied a different approach. I said before, the MAC and also Emery's wrappers were made by coating the whole textile. Thomas Burberry did something different. He used the individual strands of cotton or fiber, and they were coated with rubber, and then the garment was made, and he called that textile gabardine. And these brands, Aquascutum and Burberry, are not only connected because of what they actually produce, these coats and the textiles that they use, but both of them were very popular amongst the elites who went horseback riding, hunting, the outdoor activities that I mentioned before, but also both of them were very popular amongst adventurers, travelers, aviators. And speaking of adventurers, Burberry actually made it as far as to Antarctica, because in 1907 Sir Ernest Shackleton traveled there, and he used the Burberry gabardine not only for the clothing of the team but also for the tents that they were sleeping in. So we already see tents. There's also this link to the military, and both Aquascutum and Burberry not only supplied these adventurers, the upper class, for the outdoor activities, they also supplied the military. So we see this close link to the military. I mentioned in my introduction that World War I is very often associated with the trench coat, but it actually all started much earlier, because the trench coat had already a very long development before it actually was shaped the way we know it today. We have to look at how warfare changed, because when this changed, also the need for the clothing changed. So when we look at the Napoleonic Wars, what happened, how was warfare actually done? Usually there was a big field. You had the two opposing sides, and for the instructions and the strategy, they also had to be identified from very far away. So we have this big field. What did they wear? They usually wore bright uniforms, bright clothing, so that they could be identified. But then warfare changed, because long-range arms came up, and then soldiers in bright uniforms actually became a target. So things had to change, and now when you think of the military, which colors do you think about? You probably think about the green tones, camouflage, and khaki. Khaki, the term, actually comes from India, we could say. The origins of the word come from Persia. So the color khaki, the brown tone, is inextricably linked to the trench coat, even though my trench coat is a different interpretation in purple. But the classic one is this khaki tone. And this was first used by the British in India in the 19th century. They also wore khaki tones during the Boer Wars. And why did they wear this? It was to camouflage into the environment, because khaki is this dust brown colors, so the soldiers could better camouflage than wearing bright colors, which would make them stick out in the dust. So we traveled back to the wars of the 19th century, and now we have arrived at World War I, which is very often linked to the trench coat, and this is, as I said, because of the name. These trenches were used in World War I, so it's basically a deep long hole in the ground, and whatever is taken out from the ground is then used in front also as defense or protection. And you have to imagine this. When you think about these movies about World War I, you think about the bad weather, the rain, the darkness, and this is pretty much what these trenches were like. They were very deep. It was dark in there. A lot of soldiers were crammed in there. Very often the days were boring because nothing was going on, but then suddenly something happened. It got really frantic. They had to defend themselves. They had to attack. And so you have a lot of people in there, a lot of people who were sweating in there in different materials, whether they were waterproof or not. And then also the problem was that very often soldiers that died during the war were buried near the trenches, so you had that smell also coming along. Then it was very wet. There was rain. When it rained, the trenches flooded. Sometimes also the latrines came into the trenches. So it's not really a comfortable environment in general. And in addition to this very rough situation, the soldiers had to wear the so-called greatcoats. And these were very, very long coats. And now you can imagine, you have the situation in the trench where it's muddy, it's dirty, it's wet. So these coats were actually collecting all the mud. They were heavy. When it was raining, that material got even heavier. So there was a need for a lightweight coat, a shorter coat, and this entered actually with the people in the higher ranks, because in the beginning only the officers actually wore those trench coats. So these higher ranking officers now had the option of a garment which was easier to move in. And I would like to point out one detail which is quite important to understand the trench coat also. The soldiers had to pay for their uniforms themselves at the time, which is quite interesting, because when we think of the military today, we think about uniforms being handed out to the soldiers. Back then, this was not common. So basically, also the uniform in a certain way showed the rank of a person, because if an officer had more money, of course, they could afford the trench coats by Aquascutum and Burberry with the better material. And then also you had lower quality suppliers for those who couldn't afford it. And this whole garment also showed something else. Officers usually came from the upper class. So this was already something, when you saw somebody in a trench coat, you could tell, oh, this is an upper class officer. And over time, it also changed, because more and more officers also came from lower social classes. And then when somebody wore a trench coat, it actually signified also the social movement, and it became an aspirational garment, because by wearing a trench coat, you showed you made it, you have reached a higher rank in your career, you are allowed to wear this trench coat. And both of these brands, Aquascutum and Burberry, tried to use this aspirational character and this link to the military for themselves, because as I said before, both of them supplied the military. For example, Aquascutum supplied the uniforms for the Crimean War, and Burberry supplied the uniforms for the British Army at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is again what they have in common. But in addition to that, they also tried to establish themselves or build on this heritage with the upper class. For example, Aquascutum also made clothing for the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. And you could say this works like influencers or celebrity endorsements today. If somebody who you admire wears a certain garment, you might be likely to buy it too. And this was exactly the same what Aquascutum and Burberry tried to achieve with the trench coat. And as you can imagine, these two brands have a lot in common, but the issue for these two brands is also that both claim to be the inventors of the trench coat, or let's put it like this, a lot of articles say one or the other claims to be the inventor, or they say that these two have a row. I actually have to say I did not see anything in particular, a particular claim on either of their websites. I think this is also something that people love to talk about. I'm not sure how much the competition between Aquascutum and Burberry is still today about this particular piece of garment. I found one interesting article in the Smithsonian magazine by Linda Rodriguez McRobbie, and she says that if we need to look at either Aquascutum or Burberry as one of the inventors, Burberry may have the stronger argument, for the reason that the gabardine by Burberry was already used during the Boer Wars. And in 1912, Burberry patented a waterproof coat called Tylocken. I hope I said this correctly. And this coat is already from the description very similar to what we will call the trench coat today. But even with these pieces of information, it is very difficult to pinpoint the invention of the trench coat to one particular brand. As I said before, so many people were experimenting with the same things. We had different coats long before the trench coat that then over time led to the development of the trench coat in the shape that we know it today. It is assumed that by 1916 the trench coat was worn by officers in the British military, because some articles refer to a sketch from that year, from 1916, where there is an officer depicted in a trench coat. So we can assume this. Now we have talked a lot about the signature shape of the trench coat, but what does this trench coat actually look like? I would like to share the details that you need to look out for. If you want to buy a classic trench coat, you will see mine is a rather modern interpretation, and the classic trench coat has actually quite a few codes that you need to know to identify it as a classic one. Now let's look into those details. Today they may look merely decorative, but actually every single detail of a trench coat had a function. Think about it. People went to war, so nothing was unnecessary. Every single detail had a function. So first of all, as I said, the overcoats before were very long. The trench coat is shorter, but still long enough that most of the body parts are covered. It's also lightweight, but because it's waterproof and weather resistant, it keeps you warm. The next detail is the particular cut because it's double-breasted, and then it kind of flares out like a skirt, allowing more flexibility. And then of course a trench coat has to come with a belt, and this is not to make it look chic or accentuate the waist. Again, there was a function behind it because the belt came with D-rings. I have it in this example here. You see some kind of D-rings here too. This is also a more modern interpretation of the trench coat, and the officers could hook accessories into these D-rings. So again, you didn't need to carry them in your hand. You had the freedom of movement, the flexibility. And another important detail was the pockets. The original classic trench coat had very big pockets so that the officers could carry more accessories, for example, maps in them. And then when you look at the backside, you always have this detail that looks kind of like a cape. I never actually knew what it was for, but it actually had the function of getting rid of water. And similarly, this part here, today it's merely decorative. It's basically just sewn on top, but this used to be a so-called gun or storm flap, and this was for ventilation to make the garment breathable. And when you look at these parts here, I don't know if this is the completely classic interpretation, but a signature detail of a trench coat is that it can be buttoned up until the top here. On the one hand, to protect you from the weather, but the other reason was also the change in warfare in World War I, because gas was being used, so masks could be tucked into this coat. And there's another weatherproof characteristic, so you can button up the coat, but you also have these details here. They look quite nice, quite decorative, but actually you can pull them, and then the coat basically closes up and again protects you from cold weather and humidity. And as I said, the trench coat is lightweight, so sometimes you need it to be a bit warmer. So very often this trench coat had the feature that you can actually put in additional lining and also take it out when you didn't need it anymore. And again, we have other straps here at the top. Again, they are not merely decorative, they actually showed the rank of the soldier. Maybe you remember what I said before about the 19th century uniforms, the bright colored uniforms. It made the soldiers an easy target, and similarly here, the trench coats made the officers an easier target because now the enemy knew who were the higher ranking soldiers. And this also led to the fact that a higher proportion of officers had died in the war by the end of 1914 than lower ranking soldiers. Now, I talked a lot about the military outdoor activities, but when I think of the trench coat today, I think about a fashionable garment. I don't think anybody exercises today in a trench coat. So how did this all happen? Firstly, during the wars, a lot of people wore trench coats on the one hand because they were practical and also flattering, but also some wore them as an act of patriotism. In the time between the two wars, you could also say it was kind of romanticizing the times that people wore the trench coat. But the big boost for the trench coat came later, and it's no surprise it was through Hollywood. Think about the trench coat, we probably all immediately think also of Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca when he said goodbye to Ingrid Bergman wearing a trench coat. This was not the only movie. The trench coat also stood for something. It became the garment of gangsters, detectives, journalists. But then it also became a garment for women. Think about Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's or Marlene Dietrich in A Foreign Affair. And then there's also this very famous trench coat, a leather trench coat by Yves Saint Laurent, worn by Catherine Deneuve in Belle du Jour. So we also have the femme fatale here, and later on Meryl Streep wore a trench coat in Kramer versus Kramer. And from there it conquered the runways, so there are classic interpretations, contemporary interpretations, some looser than others, some only tweak the details, some take the shape, so basically the sky's the limit in terms of creativity. And until today, Burberry and Aquascutum are linked to the trench coat. I do have to say Burberry probably a bit more than Aquascutum. They also promoted the heritage more. When I did the research for this video, I also checked the Aquascutum website, and they do have a quote-unquote trench coat, which does not look like the classic trench coat. They rather focus on the activewear aspect, the adventurer. So I think this is a different approach of dealing with this heritage. And I would like to end this video with an anecdote by Peter Doyle. He is a military historian, and he shared his story in an article where he said he was once walking down London's Regent Street and he passed by the Burberry flagship store. And there were trench coats, and it was heavily advertised, and the slogan was trench fever. So today we look at it and say like, oh yeah, everybody is crazy about trench coats. But actually he said most people didn't get the link to history, because trench fever was actually a disease in the trenches that was transmitted by the lice. And this is probably nothing that Burberry wants to establish a link to. And I find this really funny because it shows the origins or the development of the garment, that a lot of people have actually forgotten the history. Very often we don't even know the history. We take it into this context of today. We think it's a very cool slogan, and then something like this happens. And I don't know if Burberry did this intentionally because they wanted to be funny. Maybe they also didn't think about it themselves, or they thought the customer doesn't care. In any case, I have reached the end of my video, and I would like to hear from you. Did you know about the history of the trench coat, that it actually had this very long development? Do you own a trench coat? Do you like it or do you dislike it? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, a bit of self-promotion, I would appreciate it if you could give it a like and if you could subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it yet. You can read more fashion-related articles on my website, thepinklookbook.com, and please also do check out my fashion label Pelagona. And if you liked this video, I have another video which I mentioned before. It's the video about the Louis Vuitton bag materials, where I tell you about the different trunk makers and how they all came up with basically similar techniques and methods, which today are mostly associated with Louis Vuitton. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.